All right, guys, this is part two of the lecture videos on topics 3.7 and 3.8. In the previous video, we talked a little bit about developing and developed countries, and I also talked about fertility rates. And one thing I want you to just make sure we understand is that how those fertility rates, close that door over there, is how those fertility rates uh, differ between the developing world and the developed world. So that's a big thing to remember. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about life expectancy. And again, we'll use the developing world and the developed world to reference this a little bit. But I mean, life expectancy is exactly what it says it is. Basically, how long do we expect an individual to live in a particular country? And usually, whenever we're looking at life expectancy, we're looking at it by country, right? So, um, in developed countries, again, like the U.S., we would expect life expectancy to be a lot higher. In fact, in the United States, this is a number we should probably know. The average life expectancy is about 78 years, give or take, maybe a year or so, depending. This number kind of varies every single year, kind of fluctuates a little bit, but about 78 is what it is in the US. Globally, it's about 72. So, depending on where else you live in the world, again, we look at this map, and again, you see a lot of developed countries, you know, um, US, Canada, a lot of your um, European countries, we see life expectancies that are very high. But again, I go back to Africa. A lot of these countries in yellow, these are sub-Saharan African countries. Those life expectancies get below 50 years of age. So these are a lot of developing countries. Life expectancies, they do drop off. Whereas in the developed world, they're a little bit higher. When we look at life expectancy, we can kind of look at it a couple of different ways. We can kind of break it down a little bit, different. We can look at males, we can look at females, we can look at the overall population. So if we kind of look, kind of comparing, global to the U.S. Again, global is about 72, whereas for males it's about 70, and for females it's about 74. Whereas in the U.S., again, it's about 78 overall. For males, it's about 76, and for females, it's about 81. So you can kind of, like when you really delve into the data, some interesting trends and some interesting things kind of pop up a little bit. So, regardless of whether or not you live in the U.S. or you live somewhere else in the world, females tend to live a little bit longer than males do. And again, why is that? Here's a couple of different reasons why. Men face greater dangers in the workplace, probably depending on what your job is, but um, there is some truth to that. Men make more hazardous life choices. I mean, I can't really put any specifics on that, but just kind of, I don't know, thinking about like how men live their life versus how women live their life. I don't know. I guess I don't want to sound sexist or anything, but I mean, there probably is some truth to that. Men are more likely to die in wars. That's just a fact. There are a lot more males that end up fighting in wars, and that's historically speaking. It's also the current trend, not just in the U.S. but around the world. The thing about these things, however you want to look at them, um, the gap is starting to minimize. I mean, there are more females who are, I guess, entering the workforce doing some of those jobs that at one time were totally dominated by males. For example, a buddy of mine is an iron worker up in Chicago. right? And he works on the skyscrapers and the big scaffolding, and it's kind of a dangerous job, what he does. Um, but there are more females that are going into that type of job, more though than there ever have before. There's more women that are entering the military nowadays. So again, we see these numbers starting to close a little bit, which means that maybe this gap here, between males and females is going to start shrinking as well. We're just trying to figure out, the reasons why that gap is shrinking. It's most likely because of those types of things. All right, infant and child mortality rates. I want to make sure we understand the difference between infant and child mortality. There is a difference. For infants, this is the number of deaths of children under 1 year of age per 1,000 live births. So globally, that number is 32. So let's say there's 1,000 babies born today around the world. Okay, there's more than that, but let's say there's 1,000. What this number is telling us is that 32 of those babies will not survive to see their first birthday by whatever reasons. Okay, I mean, they get killed or they don't survive the birth process or they have a disease or whatever it is. 32 of them will not survive to live 1 year of age. In the United States, that number is extremely low. All right, it's about 5.8. All right, so you can just kind of see how that difference between the global average, where there's a lot of developing countries around the world, and what it is here in the U.S. In Sweden, it's about 2.2. So I mean, talk about a super duper low infant mortality rate. That's probably where we should all try, kind of be focusing on getting to eventually. In Liberia, this is an African country, it's 99. So that's not very good. So it just shows you kind of the contrast again between the developing and the developed world. Now, child mortality is the number of deaths of children under 5. So it's just the parameters are a little bit different. Um, you know, um, I guess we look at infant mortality a little bit more so than child, um, mainly because um, if children are dying before 1, that's usually a pretty alarming um, condition. Like something is really happening in that country. Like they must have very very poor medical facilities, access to proper medicine, access to proper health care, compared to some other countries. So we really look at that infant mortality as kind of a telling statistic. But child mortality again is similar. The only difference is it goes up to age 5. So make sure we understand. So here's infant mortality again. Here's that U.S. rate about 5.8. And again, you get over here to these African countries, and you'll notice here in that area in red, it's more than 46, per thousand. Those children are not going to make it to their first birthday. So again, we see a lot of those problems happening there in Africa. You'll notice here a little bit in the Middle East, but again, a lot of these countries are war-torn countries. So it probably makes a lot of sense that their infant mortality rates would probably be a lot higher. Um, so one thing I guess too that I think is kind of an important thing to understand is that we make this correlation between infant mortality, and the lower that number, the more likely that country is to be a developed country, right? So if you've got low infant mortality rates, then we can probably make the assumption that these are some conditions in those countries, right? They have available health care, adequate food supply, good drinking water, proper sanitation, not a lot of pollution in that country. These are all characteristics of the developed world. So you have all those things, and chances are your infant mortality rates are going to be fairly low, which is a good thing. Occasionally, you see infant mortality rates um, like within a country. But if you look a little bit deeper at like different subsectors of the population, you see some variances. Here's a really good example. So let's go back to the United States. Infant mortality in the U.S. is like 5.8, right? But for African Americans, it's 13. For Native Americans, like Indian Americans, it's 8. For Caucasians, white people, it's 5. So, like when we look at infant mortality in our own country, we think of, oh, it's 5.8, that's good. But if you look at it and break it down, by these different subsectors or these different races of people, it doesn't necessarily look like it kind of averages out or it's even very even, right? So we have to kind of ask ourselves, like, why is that? I mean, let's just contrast, Caucasians and African Americans. Why is the African American population in the U.S. why is their infant mortality rate so much higher than, let's say, Caucasian people live in the U.S.? And we can spend days, talking about this, but I mean, socioeconomic status, does that have something to do with it? Does adequate health care, nutrition, does all that have something to do with it? Um, it does. There's a term here called environmental injustice. We're going to talk about it a lot more this year as the year goes on. But a lot of African American neighborhoods, for example, um, there may not be, for example, let's say a doctor's office, or there may not be a hospital, near there. There may not be, um, oh, I don't know, there may not be um, access to fresh food. Maybe all there is fast food and gas station food. I mean, it's funny. If you go to the south side of Chicago, they have these areas that are called food deserts. And literally, like if you just went to the south side of Chicago and you just walked in any direction for like 5 or 6 blocks, the only places that you can get food are fast food, gas stations, liquor stores. I mean, that's like the only places you could even find any food. There's no, you know, farmers markets with fresh vegetables. There's no grocery stores, that have like, fresh food. I mean, it's all just a bunch of garbage. Is that fair? I mean, do things like that lead to infant mortality rates being a little bit higher? Maybe that's one factor. I don't know. But this is something that we need to look at in this country, because a lot of the reasons why we see these differences amongst different racial subgroups is a lot of times because of things called environmental injustice. So we'll talk about those things again down the road, but they're kind of interesting to think about. The bottom line is these statistics don't seem like they should be this way, but they are. Finally, today, a little bit about aging and disease. I think this is kind of an interesting thing to talk about when it comes to populations and population statistics. Some countries, like the U.S., for example, we have a high life expectancy, like what, 78, something like that. We also have low infant mortality rates, right? So not only do people live a long time in our country, but our children have a good chance of surviving and living long lives, right? Now, just because we have those two things, that doesn't mean that our death rate is not going to be high. Here's a great example: the U.S. and Mexico. When you think about the U.S. versus Mexico, you would think, well, I mean, Mexico should probably have a higher death rate than what we have in the U.S. But I want you to think about a couple of things with the U.S. compared to Mexico. The U.S. has a higher life expectancy, so the average American lives longer than the average Mexican citizen. We also have lower infant mortality rates. So that means an American baby has a better chance of surviving past a year of age than a Mexican baby does. That's just fact. Okay? The statistics show that. But take a look at these numbers. In the US, 15% of our population is over the age of 65. Whereas in Mexico, it's only about 5%. So if you think about that, the crude death rate in the US is actually higher than the crude death rate in Mexico. So there's more people dying per thousand people in the US than there are in Mexico. And it has nothing really to do with life expectancy or infant mortality. It just has to do with how many people in our country are older people. We have a much older population in the US compared to what Mexico has. So that leads us to having a higher crude death rate than than in Mexico. So that's kind of an interesting thing, kind of an interesting comparison of those two countries. One more quick thing here: infectious disease. This is, these notes were put together last year before coronavirus, hit the world. Um, but the infectious disease has a pretty big toll on populations. Um, Make sure we know what the term infectious disease is. It is the second largest killer after heart disease. So like heart attacks and strokes, things like that. That's like number one. Number two is infectious disease, and it's definitely not going away because of this coronavirus thing. In fact, it's probably even higher now. But HIV, HIV and AIDS is responsible for more deaths than any other infectious disease worldwide. Um, the coronavirus is making a run at it, I'm sure. But HIV, especially in Africa, it has completely ravaged that continent. Right here it just says this is people with HIV infections. There are 19 million people just in Eastern and Southern Africa alone who have the HIV infection, who they are infected with it. You know, this is Western and Central Africa, so you add those two together, right there, here's Middle and Northern Africa. So right there, you've got close to 25, 26 million people just in one continent alone that have this particular disease, which has had a really large impact on their population. But again, that area of the world, developing countries, um, you know, what could possibly lower these statistics? Maybe education, that type of thing. But again, I want to make sure you are aware of those statistics. All right, guys, that's it for me for today. I will talk to you soon. Take care.